today we're delighted to welcome Richard Laster, who will tell us the good story about asbestos and controlling that in Israel. Erin?
Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for joining us here. And thank you especially to you, Richard, for joining us to tell your story. Richard Laster is professor of environmental law and policy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he is widely published in areas of environmental law, and particularly in water law and other areas of environmental and human rights protection. For many years, he was in fact the only environmental lawyer in Israel. Richard has a number of good stories to tell us, but today he's going to talk to us about the protection of asbestos workers in Israel and work he did there. So Richard, tell us your story.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Jimmy. It's not just protection of workers because it's also protection of the environment. And one of the key issues in this particular phenomenon, as you want to call it, I guess, is that when you find workers are ill, you should begin thinking about other people. In other words, if there's something going on in a factory, and people are getting sick, what's happening outside? What's happening to their families and other people who may also be exposed to that particular device or chemical, in this case, asbestos. And we all know that asbestos was spread around everywhere. So the danger became a worldwide problem, but the workers were the guinea pigs from the beginning. So that's an important thing to look at if you're looking at one of these problems. My involvement began we're talking about back in the 1980s. But the Asbestos factory, Israel Asbestos, Asbestos factory was set up in 1955 in a small resort town in the north of Israel called Nahariya. And it was the big factory in Nahariya. So you're talking about one of these big companies coming to a small town, and everyone wants to work there. They're paying good salaries. But I should also mention that the similar factory that was owned by some Swiss consortiums in Switzerland was closed down the same year. And they invested a third of their money into the Israeli factory. And the other 2/3 was owned by a wealthy family, today one of Israel's wealthiest families, and we know where they gained their wealth. They own the Dan Hotel system, which is also the King David Hotel. So this phenomenon, I'd like to describe it sort of as a phenomenon, began in 1955 until 1985 when the asbestos factory was closed. And part of the reason it was closed was work done by me and others. But I must admit, this is not about me particularly because we work with everyone. But we were a catalyst, a tremendous catalyst in the closing of this factory, which occurred later. I'd like to say how it started because people don't understand how you get involved in these things. How did this happen? Now, I was not working in asbestos. I was known as an environmental lawyer, not an occupational health lawyer. But I got a call from a lawyer from Detroit, Michigan, Michael Serling, and Michael was working with hundreds of cases that were filed with the Johns Manville Trust. You people may not know this, but back in the 1980s, the Johns Manville, a huge company in the States, was going bankrupt and they had to set up a trust of $4 billion. This is back in 1980, because so many workers had been injured, hundreds of thousands of workers. And so Michael called me and said, was anybody in Israel exposed to this asbestos coming from Johns Manville? Maybe we can get them in the trust. I said, I'll go up to Nahariya, I'll meet with the workers, and I'll see what happened. Were they exposed or not? I go up to Nahariya. They told me the meeting was going to be in the basement of one of the large hotels in Nahariya. I went there. They were not in the basement, they were in the sub-basement. They were actually in the air raid shelter. Now understand this again, these are workers who were scared out of their wits. They were frightened that they were going to be attacked by their own management. So they held it underground so no one could tape it. And they talked about their individual stories. That was my first exposure. And for someone like me, I got really angry because they talked about the number of their friends and family members who had worked in the factory and were ill or actually had died. And I figured something must be wrong here. It sounds like too many people dying from one place. So I looked into it. And I started that was when I began my representation of those workers in the room and their colleagues. Now, the first thing I did was not directly for the workers, but they told me that Asbestos had given out its asbestos waste. This is asbestos cement, by the way, that's what they produced. Asbestos cement waste, they'd given it out to people who wanted it, including the city of Nahariya, to make paths. I'm serious. They make paths around Nile so people could walk on it, because asbestos is an inert substance. Nothing affects it, rain, snow. And it was all over the town. So I, as a young lawyer, filed a case. This is a special thing that we have in Israel. You can file an equity case in Israel to the Supreme Court. This is a fabulous thing. We have a fabulous system. Directly to the Supreme Court for a grievance against the government. I filed with the Supreme Court, and I appeared there, and appearing on the other side was the lawyer for the city of Nahariya. And I made my plea to the judge, and he turned to the lawyer from Nahariya and he says, "This seems to be a very serious thing. And what is your response?" And this lawyer said, "The mayor has approved that we will cover all the paths in Nahariya." So the judge looked down at me and said, "Well, it seems like you got what you wanted. Will you withdraw your plea?" And I said, "Sure, I'll withdraw my plea with no, getting no cost." And I said, "Well, I won that case, but it didn't take 2 weeks to clean up those paths in Nahariya because there was no date set. And it took about 20 years. But anyway, we got the first thing out there. So that's very important. We got this thing out there that these paths are dangerous. The city started cleaning up some of them and covering the rest of them up. So things were moving. The next thing I did was I had to look into regulations to see what was protecting these workers. There must be some kind of regulations for occupational work. The regulations were very poor. Back in the 1980s, people knew a lot about asbestosis. They knew nothing about mesothelioma, the cancer that you get from asbestos. And in fact, the major study was done in 1955. So very interesting, the connection between setting up a factory in Israel in 1955. But in any case, I started looking at what was going on in the factory, and I realized there was not proper ventilation, not dampening of asbestos, not enough mass. So we applied to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to improve the regulations. And I was invited to these hearings. And here's another anecdote for people who are listening to understand what we go through when you're out there as a pioneer in these subjects. So I had realized that whenever a worker got sick, the occupational health physician on staff, and in the ISSS factory, there is a permanent occupational health physician whose salary is partly paid for by ISSS, by the company itself. I noticed that he sent notices to the management. He'd call the worker in, talk to him a little about his situation, and then send a notice to the management. And then the management would call in this worker and quietly let him go with a nice severance package. Why did they do that? It's obvious why they did it. They didn't want panic in the factory. Some people didn't know why the guy left, why he was there, why he wasn't there. But you didn't build up a groundswell of opposition in the workers in the factory by doing it. But then I raised my own question. To whom does this occupational health physician owe his loyalty? There must be a doctor-patient relationship here that something's missing. At the hearings, I asked the question to the head of occupational health in Israel. And I asked him, to whom is your loyalty? To the factory or to the worker? Now, that was a simple question. He looked at me. He was angry. He turned to the chair of the meeting and said, "Do I have to ask that question? Dr. Laster is not a member of the Knesset. He's not a member of the parliament. Seriously, ask you, do I have to ask that question?" And the chair looked back and said, "I invited Dr. Laster to the hearings, and I don't think it's such a difficult question to answer." But this is the things you get to when you're starting a sort of a fight. You're up against the establishment. Even though he's supposed to be on my side, he's not. He's automatically trying to defend himself and his colleagues. The third thing, anyway, they did change the regulations. The regulations were changed tremendously. And as you can imagine, the amount of fibers in air dropped tremendously through these regulations, and conditions got better. But the next thing we had to do, of course, was we had to go to the national insurance. That's like Social Security in the States. Because you get recognized in Israel by Social Security for occupational diseases. They make the recognition. And so I spoke to the head physician, this great woman that was head of physician at the National Insurance for Occupational Health. And she really helped me. It really did. I mean, sometimes you get, great people like that. She changed the definition of an exposed worker. Anyone who worked at the asbestos factory who had contracted any kind of related disease or any kind of cancer would be automatically recognized by national insurance. And that was a great thing, because that makes it easier. You don't have to fight every single case. You just make a claim and you get recognized. And so, as I said, we did some great things in those times. So I was very proud of what we had done. But then I made a mistake. I started representing the workers in court. Now, I have a small firm, and there were about 30 to 40 cases. I couldn't handle 30, 40 cases, but I tried to do something that I thought was very, very clever at the time. And that is 20 cases were in the magistrate court and another 15 were in the district court. And so I pleaded to the district court judge and says, listen, why don't we combine these cases? We're talking about the same factory, same dangerous substance, similar conditions. Why don't we combine these? Now, in the back of my mind was the idea was, you go before one judge with one case, he doesn't make an impression. You go one judge with 30 cases, you've got a pattern. You can see that that's a great impression. You can get a better result. The judge says, I'm sorry, I'm bound by Israeli law, which is up to a certain amount of money. That's a cap. You can't appeal that in a district court. You have to take it to the magistrate's court. Well, I appealed his decision to the Supreme Court. And you should probably know, maybe I should, I don't know if I should, maybe I shouldn't say, this is all pro bono, by the way. Nobody's paying me for this. No one's going to believe me, but that's true. I mean, this is all pro bono. So we appealed to the Supreme Court, and my partner pleaded the case. I was there, as the appellant. My partner pleaded the case for our side, and the representative of the insurance company, East Asbestos, was pleading the case for the company. And the Supreme Court judge was an astute, he was a fabulous judge. He really is one of the best judges in the history of Israel. He listened patiently, and he wrote an opinion later on that he couldn't change the law. He couldn't change the law. So at that point, I realized I'd taken a bit more than I could handle. So I started giving out the cases to lawyers up in the north in Nahariya, because all the cases were in Haifa, Nahariya, and I live in Jerusalem. So I realized I just couldn't do it. But I had one case left. And this is a very sad case. This is a good story, by the way, but there's some sad cases in here. It's a very sad case because the fellow was 44 years old when he came to see me and had mesothelioma. Now, meso takes about 40 years, between 30 and 40 years to develop, which means he was 4 years old when he contracted the disease. Now, he didn't work at the factory. So I asked the judge if I could put him on the stand early because he only had 18 months to live. Now, this is really tough for me as a lawyer. And I had to sort of say to him, I have to put you on the stand now, even though the case hasn't really begun, but we have to get you on the stand early. He probably knew it, but he only had 18 months. So we had the hearing, and he said that his father would come home with clothes that he wore at the factory. They didn't change clothes in those days. In the new regulations, they change clothes, they take showers and everything. The old days, they didn't. And he would hug his father. Now that just kills you, okay? That knocks you out. I mean, you're sitting listening to this, poor guy. And he breathed in the asbestos dust from his father's clothes, and 40 years later, he got mesothelioma. And unfortunately, he died 2 months after the hearing. And that for me that was sort of the deciding issue that I put in the 15 years of my life. I've spent quite a lot of time on this case, and it's affecting me personally. And I decided to pull back and let other lawyers take over the cases. So to sum up, I'd like to say this. I was helped, first of all, by a young medical professional, also who studied in the States and came to Israel like me. And he had worked in the Ministry of Health. And he also helped me in these cases tremendously because I had to have backing from a professional. And in fact, when he was at the Ministry of Health, he demanded that the x-rays that had been taken at the East Asbestos factory, because they took x-rays, they have occupational health, be sent to Mount Sinai. Maybe some of you know who Irving Selikoff is. Irving Selikoff was an icon at the time. And we sent it to Mount Sinai. This friend of mine, Eli Richter, Dr. Richter, sent it, who had worked there. So he knew Selikoff. And the Selikoff's team found that their x-ray machine found 75 more cases than the Israeli occupational health, simply because the machines were better. That caused a tremendous, you can imagine, explosion in the factory. And as a result, the management changed the conditions of work. They also changed the severance pay. Anyone contracted disease got double severance pay. But that also changed the whole atmosphere in the factory. And that began sort of the demise of the whole system. Nobody wanted to work there. And so over time, as I said, the factory finally did close down in 1995 because the costs were too heavy. The workers didn't want to, everybody understands. And of course, asbestos was also spread around Israel. We built a lot of things with asbestos cement. Even the dorms at the Hebrew University were called asbestonium, built out of asbestos cement. So that problem also, so East West had to put up a fund to do cleanup, but this cost the government a lot of money too, because they finally closed down and that mess was left around for a lot of other people to do. So is it a good story? Well, of course it's good, because what you learn from it is if one or two dedicated people, I'm serious, one or two dedicated people can make a change. Now, people don't think that's true, but it is true. You dedicate your time. I was working my regular work and I was getting paid for other things. I took this on pro bono because I had to. And you can do it. I keep telling my students the same thing. If you really want to make a change, but you have to have skills. We're talking about lawyers, and I use my skill as a lawyer, and my friend Ellie used his skill as a doctor. Now I couldn't, that's the critical thing. The second thing is you have to have facts. You can't just walk in and say, I'm going to take care. No, I was supported by Dr. Richter and a team of scientists to make my plea. He was also at the hearings at the Knesset, the parliament. He was also making a plea. So you've got to have facts. You've got to have dedication. You obviously have the empathy. But the empathy affected me so much at the end that I had to leave because it was affecting me. I mean, there's a limit to what you can take on yourself because I'm not a crass lawyer. I'm a guy that takes on cases that I like, and I like my people, like my client. So yes, it's a tremendous success. And as I said before at the very beginning, there's other things you can learn from it. The one thing you really have to learn is that people in factories making certain things are guinea pigs. And if people understand what I'm saying, it wasn't a case, people can confer with me, there was a pesticides factory in Israel making a pesticide. The workers were sitting around the table talking among themselves. And they said, you know what? How many kids have you got? How many kids? And they found out that they all had children until they started working at this pesticide factory. And then they found out that DCPP, or whatever it was called, that particular pesticide, sterilized men. Just like that. They found out. The workers found out. So again, if anyone is watching this video and they're working with workers in occupational health, you have to realize this spreads itself out. The second thing is, I don't want to say that making asbestos was new technology in 1955. It wasn't new technology. It was new technology for Israel. The introduction of new technology has to be monitored. Someone has to follow up and see what's going on. Now, people are doing that with cell phones today. Rightfully so. We don't know the effect of cell phones. I could even get carried away and say, what's happening in Tik Tok, the way these play, I don't know what that is, but there's something called Tik Tok out there. And I understand a lot of young girls, maybe it's not Tik Tok, maybe something else, are finding it very difficult to face this Tik Tok situation and often find themselves a psychological problem. Where are we going to be 20 years from now? Who's following up on that? That's a critical question for anyone watching this video, and no one does it. Someone has to think this particular problem that covers not just one person, but hundreds of people, and maybe in the case of whatever it's called, TikTok, maybe it's thousands of people. What's going to happen 20 years from now? And someone has to be doing that. So whether you're a lawyer or a physician, or if you're in social work or psychology, if you want to take on something, then go for it. Look at it. It doesn't have to take all your life away. Spend a certain portion of your time doing something that you want to dedicate, because in the end, it makes you feel good. Obviously, everybody knows that. You look back, like when you and Aaron contacted me for a good story, I said, sure, I've got a good story. I did some good things. Nobody knows. Who knows about it? Just me. So I said, sure, I'll be interviewed and I'll be happy to talk about what I did, because I think it's important that other people realize that you can do it, and you can do it with very little, really very little help. You need, as I said, you need support, you need some facts, you need some science, but if you're dedicated enough, you can do it. So that's my good story on asbestos.
That's a great one. And it shows what, like you mentioned, what a few people can do. A few people who are committed to, to doing the right thing. And in your context, it was protecting workers and, making it so that their working environment could be improved, addressing the after effects of asbestosis and those who suffer these cancers. And without you, that wouldn't have happened. And that's one of the reasons that makes it a great legal story. So
it might have happened, but it may have happened later. And this way, I think we saved more lives. But it wasn't just the workers. Remember, we also got into the environment. And that was a very critical issue, because I'm sure people stopped using asbestos in their homes. And of course, they stopped putting the pattern, but there's certain things that, you broke the pattern, you stopped things from happening. And so we saved lives, for sure.